After saving an injured wolf years ago, a man is shocked to find it on his doorstep. But the message it brings points to a secret that could change his life forever. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. Jake Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished working on an old Chevrolet in his garage. The morning sun was already beating down on the small Utah town where he'd built his reputation as the most reliable mechanic within 50 miles. His weathered hands showed the evidence of 15 years of manual labor, but at 34, he felt satisfied with the simple life he'd carved out for himself. That morning in 2019 changed everything. While driving to work through the desert outskirts, Jake spotted something unusual in his headlights, a gray mass lying motionless on the roadside. He pulled over, expecting to find debris, but instead discovered a wounded wolf. The animal's leg was caught in an illegal trap, its fur matted with blood and desert dust. Most people would have called animal control, but something in the wolf's golden eyes caught Jake off guard. The animal didn't show fear or aggression. Instead, it maintained steady eye contact, almost as if asking for help. Despite the obvious risks, Jake approached slowly, talking in a low, calm voice. "Easy there, big guy," he murmured, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Using his mechanics, tools, and the first aid kit from his truck, Jake managed to free the wolf's leg and clean the wound. Throughout the entire process, the wolf remained unnaturally still, only occasionally letting out a soft whine. Jake brought the wolf to his workshop, converting a storage room into a makeshift recovery space. Over the next few weeks, he tended to the animal's injuries, watching as it regained strength. The wolf never showed aggression, instead developing what Jake could only describe as a partnership with him. They formed a connection that defied explanation, communicating through subtle gestures and looks. When the wolf finally healed, Jake released it back into the wild. The animal lingered at the edge of the desert for a moment, turned to look at Jake one last time, then disappeared into the landscape. Jake often thought about the wolf over the next few years, but life returned to normal. He continued fixing cars, dating occasionally, and maintaining his quiet existence. 4 years later, Jake stumbled out of bed at dawn, responding to persistent scratching at his front door. Opening it, he found himself face to face with the same wolf, now larger, healthier, and more magnificent than before. The animal sat regally on his doorstep, its golden eyes unchanged by time. But something was different. Hanging from a leather cord around the wolf's neck was a small pouch made of worn deerskin. With steady hands, Jake carefully removed it. Inside, he found a piece of weathered parchment covered in unfamiliar symbols. The markings looked like writing, but in no language Jake recognized. Later that day, Jake showed the message to his friend Mike at the local diner. Mike, a history teacher at the high school, studied the symbols with growing excitement. "Jake, these look like Native American petroglyphs," Mike said, spreading the parchment carefully on the table. "But they're not just random symbols. This is organized like actual writing. You need to show this to someone who specializes in indigenous languages." Jake stared at the mysterious message, thousands of questions flooding his mind. Why had the wolf returned? What did these symbols mean? And why did he feel such a deep, inexplicable connection to all of it? The wolf remained outside his house, watching, waiting. For the first time in his life, Jake felt like he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than himself. His simple life as a small-town mechanic suddenly seemed like a prelude to something he couldn't yet understand. That night, unable to sleep, Jake sat on his porch with the wolf beside him. The desert stars spread across the sky like scattered diamonds, and the cool night air carried the scent of sage. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change dramatically, and somehow, this mysterious animal was the key to unlocking a truth he never knew he was seeking. Jake's past, present, and future seemed to converge in that moment. Marked by ancient symbols and the steady presence of a wolf, who had chosen him for reasons he had yet to discover. The message in his hands felt like both a gift and a challenge, waiting to reveal secrets that would reshape his understanding of who he truly was. Dr. Sarah Martinez's office at the University of Utah was cramped but organized, with walls lined with books about indigenous languages and artifacts. As she examined the parchment through her reading glasses, Jake noticed her expression shift from professional interest to genuine excitement. "This is extraordinary," she said, carefully placing the parchment under a specialized light. These symbols combine elements from several Native American writing systems, primarily those of the Southwest tribes. But there's something unique about them. They're organized in a way I've never seen before. Jake leaned forward in his chair. "Can you read it?" "Parts of it," Dr. Martinez replied, making careful notes. "It appears to be a message about heritage and bloodlines. There are repeated references to the sleeping truth and the path home. But what's most interesting is this symbol here." She pointed to a complex marking at the bottom of the parchment. "This is a family marker, similar to what some tribes used to identify lineage. Jake, I think this message was meant specifically for you." The revelation sent Jake straight to the county records office. He spent hours digging through dusty files and old microfilm records, tracing his family tree backward. His parents had died in a car accident when he was young, and he'd been raised by his maternal grandmother, who never spoke much about their family history. In a forgotten corner of the archives, Jake discovered a file that made his hands shake. It contained documents from the 1950s, official government papers, documenting the forced relocation of several Native American families from their ancestral lands. Among the names listed was Thompson, his grandmother's maiden name. Further investigation revealed a painful truth. His grandmother's family had belonged to the Shadow River tribe, a small but proud people who had lived in the Utah territories for generations. The government had forcibly removed them from their lands, dispersing the tribe members to different areas and effectively dismantling their community. Jake sat back in his chair, struggling to process this information. His grandmother's silence about their past suddenly made sense. It had been too painful to discuss. He remembered her quiet dignity, the way she would sometimes stand in their backyard at sunset, facing west with closed eyes. She had carried this history within her, choosing to protect him from the weight of their family's displacement. Returning home that evening, Jake found the wolf waiting patiently in his yard. The animal's presence now carried new meaning. In many Native American traditions, wolves were considered spiritual guides, bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. The connection he'd felt with the animal from their first meeting suddenly seemed less random and more like destiny. Jake pulled out an old photo album his grandmother had left him. Looking at her pictures with new eyes, he noticed details he'd missed before. The traditional patterns on some of her clothing, the distinctive jewelry she wore, the way she arranged certain objects in their home. All were subtle markers of a heritage she had maintained in secret. The wolf approached and sat beside him as he flipped through the album. Its presence felt different now, less mysterious but more significant. This wasn't just a wild animal he had once helped. It was a messenger, a guide sent to help him uncover a truth that had been buried for generations. That night, Jake dreamed of vast desert landscapes he'd never seen but somehow recognized. He saw his grandmother as a young woman, standing proud among her people. He witnessed their displacement, felt their pain and resilience. The wolf appeared in his dreams, leading him through these visions, showing him glimpses of a heritage he had never known was his. When he woke, Jake felt a profound shift in his understanding of himself. The simple life he had built as a mechanic now seemed like a temporary shelter, a pause in a much longer journey. The wolf's appearance, the mysterious message, his newly discovered heritage, all were pieces of a puzzle he was just beginning to understand. As dawn broke over the desert, Jake watched the wolf from his porch. The animal's golden eyes held the same steady gaze that had first caught his attention years ago. But now Jake understood that their connection wasn't just about that one act of kindness on a desert road. It was about something deeper, a calling to reclaim a legacy that had been systematically erased. The wolf wasn't just a companion anymore. It was a bridge to a past he needed to understand and a future he needed to shape. As the morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and red, Jake realized that finding his true identity wouldn't be as simple as reading old documents or translating ancient symbols. It would require him to embrace a heritage that had been silenced for generations and find his place within it. The Shadow River Reservation sprawled across 30 miles of desert landscape, marked by scattered mobile homes and traditional structures. Jake's truck kicked up dust as he drove past the weathered welcome sign, his heart pounding with each mile. The wolf had led him here, appearing and disappearing along his route like a ghostly guide. The tribal office was a modest building with peeling paint and a small parking lot. As Jake stepped out of his truck, he felt the weight of suspicious stares from a group of men sitting outside the neighboring convenience store. He couldn't blame them. The reservation had dealt with its share of outsiders claiming connection to the tribe, usually when casino money or land rights were involved. Inside the office, an elderly clerk looked up from her computer, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. "Can I help you? My name is Jake Thompson," he said, placing his grandmother's documents on the counter. "I recently discovered that my grandmother, Sarah Thompson, was from this tribe. She was part of the families relocated in the 1950s. The clerk's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Many people come here claiming tribal connections. Mr. Thompson, what makes your case different?" Before Jake could answer, a commanding female voice cut through the tension. "I'll handle this, Marie." The woman who stepped forward carried herself with natural authority. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with long black hair streaked with silver and sharp eyes that seemed to look straight through Jake's defenses. She wore jeans and a work shirt, but the traditional jewelry around her neck marked her as someone important in the community. "I'm Ayanna Blackhawk, tribal council member," she said, extending her hand. "Why don't we talk in my office?" As they settled into her small office, Jake noticed the wolf had appeared outside the window, sitting calmly in plain view. Ayanna followed his gaze, and her professional demeanor shifted subtly. "How long has he been following you?" she asked, her voice softer. "You know about the wolf?" Ayanna's lips curved into a slight smile. "That wolf has been appearing around the reservation for generations. We call him the messenger. He doesn't show himself to just anyone." She leaned forward, studying Jake more intently. "Tell me everything from the beginning." For the next hour, Jake shared his story. The rescue, the message, his discoveries about his grandmother. Ayanna listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the wolf outside. "Your grandmother was Sarah Thompson," Ayanna said finally, opening an old leather-bound book on her desk. "I knew I recognized the name. She was one of the last to leave during the relocation. The elders still talk about how she refused to go until they threatened to remove her children by force." Jake felt a lump in his throat. "I never knew. Many didn't speak of those times," Ayanna said. "The pain was too fresh. But there's something else you should know." She turned the book toward him, revealing a page of handwritten notes. "Your grandmother was more than just a tribal member. She came from a line of storytellers, keepers of our oldest traditions. The wolf was said to appear to her family line as a guardian and guide." Outside, the wolf stood and moved closer to the window, its presence drawing the attention of people passing by. Word of its appearance spread quickly through the reservation, and soon a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. "The messenger hasn't appeared like this in decades," Ayanna explained. "Some of our people have lost connection with the old ways, but everyone knows what this means. The wolf is a symbol of protection, of guidance. We call it the guardian of the forest in our stories. Though there's little forest left here now." She studied Jake thoughtfully. "You said you're a mechanic." Jake nodded. "Good with your hands, then. Practical. That's important." Too many come here looking for spiritual enlightenment without understanding that our ways are rooted in practical connection to the land and community. Rising from her desk, Ayana moved to a wall covered in photographs. These are our sacred sites, places where our ancestors lived, prayed, and were buried. Places that still hold power. She touched one photo showing a red rock formation. The wolf appears most often near these sites. It's said to protect them, and to choose those who will continue that protection. Jake absorbed this information, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. What am I supposed to do? First, Ayana said, you need to understand who you are, not just as Jake Thompson the mechanic, but as a descendant of the Shadow River people. The wolf has chosen you for a reason, and based on what's been happening around our lands lately, I suspect that reason will become clear soon enough. She glanced out the window again, where the wolf still sat sentinel. For now, I'll help you learn our ways. The people here will be suspicious at first. We've had too many disappointments, but the wolf's presence will open doors. Just remember, with that comes responsibility. As they stepped outside, the gathered crowd parted silently. The wolf rose and walked to Jake's side, its presence both a blessing and a challenge. In that moment, Jake understood that his journey wasn't just about discovering his past. It was about stepping into a role he never knew he was meant to fill, becoming part of a story much larger than himself. The sun was setting over the reservation, painting the desert in deep oranges and purples. Jake felt the eyes of the community on him, some curious, some skeptical, all waiting to see what this stranger with the wolf would mean for their future. His simple life as a mechanic seemed very far away now, replaced by something both terrifying and exhilarating, a chance to reconnect with a heritage that had been stolen, and perhaps to help protect what remained. The discovery came during Jake's third week of visiting the reservation. He and Ayana were reviewing old land documents when Trevor Martinez, another council member, burst into the office, his face tight with concern. "They've filed the papers," Trevor announced, dropping a thick folder on Ayana's desk. "Summit Mining Corporation. They're claiming rights to the northeastern quarter of the reservation, including the Ridge of Ancestors." Ayana's hand froze over the documents she'd been showing Jake. "How? That land is protected under the tribal trust. They found a loophole," Trevor explained, spreading out several maps. "The original boundary survey from 1963 shows a discrepancy. They're arguing that a 3-mile strip along the ridge was never properly registered as tribal land." Jake studied the maps, his mechanic's eye catching the technical details. The ridge in question was a sacred site, home to ancient burial grounds and petroglyphs that dated back centuries. It was also, according to the geological surveys scattered across the desk, rich in rare earth minerals essential for modern technology. "Summit Mining isn't just any company," Ayana explained, pulling up their corporate profile on her computer. "They're a subsidiary of Globotech Resources, one of the largest mining conglomerates in the world. They have a history of exploiting legal technicalities to access restricted lands." The wolf, which had been dozing in the corner of the office, suddenly stood at attention, its ears forward. Through the window, they could see dust clouds rising from the direction of the ridge. "They're already moving equipment in," Trevor said grimly. "They're not waiting for the legal proceedings to conclude." Jake followed Ayana and Trevor to the site in his truck. As they crested the last hill, the scale of the operation became clear. A fleet of heavy machinery lined the access road: bulldozers, drilling rigs, and massive hauling trucks. Workers in hard hats were marking boundaries with bright orange surveyor's tape, cutting through areas Jake knew contained ancient prayer circles. "This is their standard practice," Ayana explained, her voice tight with anger. "They start operations immediately, knowing that legal challenges can take years. By the time any ruling comes down, the damage is often already done." The wolf paced along the ridge line above them, its presence drawing nervous glances from the mining company workers. One of the surveyors dropped his equipment and refused to continue working, pointing at the animal and speaking rapidly to his supervisor. "We need to call an emergency council meeting," Trevor said. "Get the whole tribe involved." That evening, the tribal community center was packed. Elders sat in the front row, their faces grave as Trevor explained the situation. Young mothers held crying babies, while teenagers filmed the proceedings on their phones, already planning social media campaigns. Jake sat near the back, conscious of his status as an outsider, even with his newly discovered heritage. Ayanna stood before the crowd, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "Summit Mining isn't just threatening our land, they're threatening our history, our ancestors, our very identity as a people. The Ridge of Ancestors holds the remains of our great-grandparents, the art of our ancestors, the stories of our people written in stone." An elderly man stood up, leaning on his cane. "My grandfather is buried in those hills. He fought in World War II, came home with medals, but still couldn't vote or own land in town. That ridge was the only place he felt at peace. Now they want to tear it up for minerals." The discussion continued for hours. Some advocated for immediate physical resistance, forming blockades to stop the machinery. Others pushed for legal action, wanting to fight Summit Mining in the courts. A few, beaten down by years of similar battles, suggested trying to negotiate for compensation. Jake listened to it all, feeling the weight of his newfound connection to this community. The wolf had led him here for a reason, and watching the pain and determination in these faces, he began to understand why. A young woman near the front stood up. "What about him?" She pointed at Jake. "He shows up with the messenger wolf, right when this starts happening. That has to mean something." All eyes turned to Jake. The wolf, which had been sitting quietly by the door, moved to his side, its presence both a comfort and a challenge. Ayanna met Jake's eyes across the room. "In our stories, the messenger appears when the tribe faces its greatest challenges. It chooses allies who can help us fight battles we can't win alone." Jake stood slowly, feeling the weight of generations watching him. His grandmother had been forced from this land, her stories silenced, her heritage buried. Now, decades later, her grandson stood in a position to help protect what remained. "I'm not a lawyer," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "I'm not a politician or an activist. I fix things that are broken. Right now, something is very broken here, and maybe that's why I was led here. I don't know exactly how yet, but I want to help." The wolf threw back its head and howled, the sound echoing off the community center walls. One by one, people began to nod, some wiping away tears, others sitting straighter in their chairs. Outside, the sun was setting behind the Ridge of Ancestors, casting long shadows across the land Summit Mining wanted to destroy. Jake could see the company's equipment lined up like an invading army, waiting to tear open the earth. The fight ahead would require everything he had learned in both his worlds, the practical skills of a mechanic and the spiritual connection he was just beginning to understand. The wolf's choice of him wasn't about mystical powers or ancient prophecies. It was about having the right person, with the right skills and the right heritage, in the right place at the right time. As the meeting continued around him, Jake began to form a plan, one that would require both modern expertise and ancient wisdom to execute. The morning of the protest dawned clear and cold. Jake stood at the entrance to Summit Mining's regional headquarters in Salt Lake City, surrounded by over 200 tribal members and supporters. The sign he held read "Protect Sacred Land" in both English and his ancestors' language, words Ayanna had taught him to write. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Jake had never sought the spotlight, but now he found himself thrust into it. His story, the mechanic who discovered his indigenous heritage through a mysterious wolf, had caught the media's attention, adding a compelling narrative to what might otherwise have been a local land dispute. "Remember," Ayanna said, adjusting the microphone on Jake's shirt collar, "stay focused on the legal violations. Summit Mining started work without proper environmental impact studies. They're destroying archaeological sites protected by federal law. Don't let them turn this into a story about mysticism or supernatural wolves. The crowd behind them had grown larger, with people carrying signs showing before and after photos of lands destroyed by Summit Mining's operations in other states. College students, environmental activists, and members of other tribes had joined the Shadow River people, forming a diverse coalition of resistance. As Jake prepared to address the crowd, he caught movement at the edge of his vision. The wolf had appeared, standing atop a nearby parking structure, visible to everyone. The news cameras swung toward it, and a murmur ran through the crowd. Even the security guards at the building's entrance stared in amazement. "My grandmother was forced from these lands," Jake began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "She lost her home, her community, her ability to pass on our traditions openly. Now, decades later, what little land remains is being threatened by corporate greed disguised as legal rights." The wolf howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the downtown buildings. Camera flashes erupted, and social media live streams captured the moment as Jake continued speaking. Summit Mining claims they're bringing jobs and progress, but what they're really doing is destroying irreplaceable cultural heritage. They're desecrating burial grounds that hold our ancestors. They're erasing stories carved in stone thousands of years ago, all for minerals that will be gone in a decade, leaving nothing but a scarred and poisoned landscape. As he spoke, Jake noticed movement inside the building. Executives in suits gathered at the windows, their faces concerned. Summit Mining had clearly not expected this level of organized resistance or media attention. Ayana stepped forward next, her voice strong and clear. "We have documentation of endangered species on that land. We have archaeological surveys proving the historical significance of the sites they're destroying. We have evidence of water table contamination from their other operations. This isn't just about protecting native land, it's about protecting everyone's future." The protest continued throughout the day, growing larger as people from nearby offices joined during their lunch breaks. The wolf remained visible, a silent sentinel that reporters couldn't stop filming. Its presence transformed what might have been dismissed as another environmental protest into something that captured the public's imagination. By late afternoon, Summit Mining's PR team emerged from the building, announcing that the company's CEO would like to meet with tribal representatives. Jake and Ayana exchanged glances, knowing this was both an opportunity and a risk. "They'll try to divide us," Ayana warned as they prepared to enter the building. "Offer compensation to some, pressure others. It's how they've broken similar resistance movements." Jake nodded, thinking of the wolf watching from above. They don't understand what they're really fighting against. This isn't just about land or minerals. It's about recognizing that some things are worth more than money. Inside the corporate lobby, with its sleek marble floors and abstract art, Jake felt the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. In his work clothes and boots, he stood out among the suits and ties. But he also carried something they couldn't buy or bulldoze, a connection to the land that went beyond legal documents and mineral rights. The media attention had done its job. #WolfProtector and #SaveShadowRidge were trending on social media. Videos of the wolf howling over Jake's speech had gone viral. Summit Mining found itself facing not just a local land dispute, but a growing narrative about corporate greed versus indigenous rights and environmental protection. As they waited to be escorted to the meeting, Jake's phone buzzed with messages from other tribal communities facing similar battles. The wolf's appearance and Jake's story had sparked something larger than themselves. What started as a personal journey of discovery was becoming a symbol of resistance against the ongoing erasure of indigenous lands and culture. The wolf's howl echoed again from outside, carrying through the glass and steel of the corporate headquarters. To Jake's surprise, he could now understand it not just as a sound, but as a reminder of everything at stake. In the reflection of the polished elevator doors, he saw himself transformed. No longer just a mechanic searching for his identity, but a bridge between past and present, tradition and progress, sacrifice and survival. The upcoming meeting would be just the beginning. Summit Mining might have money and legal teams, but Jake and his people had something more powerful, a connection to the land that transcended ownership, and a determination to protect what remained of their heritage, no matter the cost. The conference room on Summit Mining's top floor offered a panoramic view of Salt Lake City, but Jake's attention was fixed on Richard Blackwood, the company's executive vice president, who stood at the head of the table, sliding a manila envelope across its polished surface. "Before we begin formal negotiations," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone used to making deals, "there's something you should know about your family history, Mr. Thompson." Jake felt Ayanna tense beside him. The wolf, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, paced on a nearby rooftop. "Your grandmother's departure from the tribe wasn't as simple as government relocation," Blackwood continued, opening the envelope. "We've done extensive research into the land claims, including personal histories of the families involved." He withdrew a stack of yellowed documents. "Sarah Thompson, your grandmother, was involved in a federal investigation in 1953. She was accused of selling information about tribal sacred sites to mining companies." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He heard Ayanna's sharp intake of breath. "That's impossible," Jake said. But Blackwood was already laying out photocopies of old reports and signed statements. The case was ultimately dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the documentation exists. Your grandmother accepted payment for information about mineral deposits on tribal lands. The shame of this discovery led to her voluntary departure from the reservation, not forced relocation, as you've been led to believe. Jake's hands shook as he examined the documents. The signatures looked authentic. There were bank deposit records, witness statements, even photographs of his grandmother meeting with men in suits. "Why are you showing me this?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But movements like yours require symbols, Ms. Blackhawk, strong narratives. Right now, you have a compelling story. The prodigal son returned, guided by a mysterious wolf, fighting to protect his heritage. How compelling will that story be when people learn his grandmother betrayed her own people?" Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The wolf outside let out a low growl that somehow carried through the thick windows. "Think about it," Blackwood said, sliding a business card across the table. "You have 24 hours before these documents become public record. Of course, if you decide to step down as the face of the resistance and encourage a more cooperative approach to negotiations, we could ensure these records remain sealed." The elevator ride down was silent. In the lobby, Ayanna pulled Jake into an empty conference room. "They're trying to manipulate you," she said firmly. "Even if those documents are real, they don't change who you are or what we're fighting for." But Jake couldn't shake the sick feeling in his stomach. The grandmother he remembered, strong, quiet, dignified, seemed at odds with the woman in those documents. Yet the evidence looked convincing. "I need time to think," he said. That evening, Jake sat in his truck at the Ridge of Ancestors, watching the sunset paint the sacred hills in shades of gold and purple. The wolf appeared silently beside his vehicle, its golden eyes reflecting the fading light. "Did you know?" Jake asked aloud. "Is that why you chose me? To make up for what she did?" The wolf's steady gaze offered no answers. Below them, Summit Mining's equipment sat idle, waiting to tear into the earth that held generations of his people's history. Jake pulled out his phone and looked at the trending hashtags. #WolfProtector, #Defend the Sacred, #Stand with Shadow Ridge. Thousands of people had taken up their cause, inspired by the story of a mechanic reconnecting with his heritage through a mysterious wolf. How many would stand with them if they knew the truth, or what Summit Mining claimed was the truth? His phone buzzed with a text from Ayanna. "Whatever you decide, remember why the wolf chose you. Not your grandmother's past, but your present. Your choices. As darkness settled over the ridge, Jake watched the wolf move to stand at the edge of the sacred burial ground. Its howl carried across the valley, echoing off the ancient rocks that held his people's stories. In that sound, Jake heard something beyond shame or vindication, a reminder that some truths ran deeper than paper trails and corporate threats. The decision he faced wasn't just about protecting his reputation or the movement's momentum. It was about whether he would let the shadows of the past determine the future of his people's land. His grandmother's alleged actions, true or false, were part of a larger story of survival in impossible circumstances. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between protecting his family's name and protecting the land itself. But tonight, under the desert stars, with the wolf as his witness, Jake began to understand that real redemption might require sacrificing both. Dawn found Jake and Ayana hiking deep into the reservation's backcountry, following paths that didn't appear on any modern maps. The wolf led the way, pausing occasionally to ensure they kept pace. Behind them walked Sarah Whitefeather, one of the tribe's eldest members, her steady steps belying her 87 years. "Your grandmother and I were friends," Sarah said, breaking the pre-dawn silence. "Those papers Summit Mining showed you, they're real, but they're not the whole truth." Sarah Thompson was many things, but she was never a traitor. They reached a hidden valley just as the sun crested the eastern ridge. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock walls, telling stories that stretched back centuries. The wolf sat beside a particular panel, its tail brushing against images of people and animals carved into the stone. Sarah touched the weathered rock surface. "This is where your grandmother's family was storytellers for generations. See these marks. They record the Great Drought of 1846, when the wolf first appeared to guide our people to water." Jake studied the petroglyphs, recognizing symbols similar to those on the message the wolf had brought him. "Why didn't she ever tell me about any of this?" "Because of what really happened in 1953, Sarah replied, lowering herself onto a boulder. "The mining companies back then were different branches of the same tree we're fighting now. They threatened to have her children, your mother and uncle, taken away by social services if she didn't cooperate. They wanted her to sign papers to make it look like she was willingly giving them information." Ayana pulled out her phone, documenting the petroglyphs. "This matches what I found in the tribal archives last night. There were other families threatened the same way. The mining companies knew the government would believe them over us. Your grandmother made a choice," Sarah continued. "She signed their papers, took their money, but she gave them false information, led them away from the real sacred sites. When they discovered her deception, she had to leave to protect her children. The documents Summit Mining has told the story they wanted told." The wolf moved to another panel of petroglyphs, this one showing a circle of figures around a central fire. Sarah smiled at the animal's choice. "This tells the story of the Great Gathering, when all the scattered bands of our people came together to survive a harsh winter. Unity in the face of threat. It's a lesson we've had to learn many times." Throughout the day, they visited other sacred sites across the reservation. At each location, Sarah shared stories that had been passed down through generations. The wolves seemed to choose their path, leading them to places where the tribe's history was written in stone and earth. Near sunset, they reached a hidden cave high in the cliffs. Inside, protected from weather and vandals, the walls bore paintings more vivid than any they'd seen before. The images showed wolves leading people through difficult times, during hunts, through harsh winters, away from dangers. "The wolf has always been more than just an animal to us," Sarah explained, her voice echoing in the sacred space. "It represents the connection between what we can see and what we can only feel. When the wolf chooses someone, it's not just about that person, it's about what they represent in the larger story of our people." Jake touched one of the cave paintings, feeling the texture of pigments applied by hands long ago. "Summit Mining wants me to believe my grandmother's actions should shame me into backing down. that her choices somehow invalidate everything we're doing now. They don't understand, Ayana said, her voice firm. Every person in this tribe carries both beauty and pain in their history. We've all made impossible choices to survive. What matters is what we do now, with the challenges in front of us. The wolf moved to the cave's entrance, silhouetted against the setting sun. Its howl echoed through the canyon, and to Jake's surprise, he was answered by other wolves in the distance. Real wolves, their voices joining in an ancient chorus. "Listen," Sarah said, closing her eyes. "The land itself remembers. Every story, every choice, every sacrifice. When you speak against Summit Mining, you're not just speaking for yourself, or even for the tribe. You're speaking for all of this. The rocks that hold our stories, the paths our ancestors walked, the spirits that still guard these places." As darkness fell, they made their way back down the cliff face by flashlight. The wolf stayed close, its eyes reflecting the beam of light. Jake felt different, lighter somehow, despite the weight of what he'd learned. His grandmother's true story wasn't one of betrayal, but of desperate courage, of finding ways to resist when direct opposition wasn't possible. Back at the tribal offices, Ayana spread out a map of the reservation. Summit Mining doesn't just want the ridge of ancestors. These documents show their planned expansion over the next 5 years. They'll take everything we've seen today, all these sacred sites, all these stories. Jake looked at the wolf, remembering every site they'd visited, every story they'd heard. "Then we'll stop them, not just for the tribe now, but for everyone who's ever had to make impossible choices to protect what matters. My grandmother did what she could in her time. This is our time." The wolf pressed against his leg, and Jake felt the connection that had first sparked when he found the injured animal years ago. It wasn't just about him anymore, or even about his newly discovered heritage. It was about standing at a crossroads of history, choosing which stories would survive and which would be lost forever to the mining company's machines. Tomorrow, Summit Mining's deadline would expire. They would release their version of his grandmother's story, trying to shame him into silence. But now, having walked the sacred lands and heard the true history of his people, Jake knew that some choices transcended personal reputation. The wolf had chosen him not despite his grandmother's past, but because of it, because he came from a line of people who found ways to resist, even when resistance seemed impossible. The sound of heavy machinery shattered the pre-dawn silence at the Ridge of Ancestors. Summit Mining had moved in overnight, their bulldozers advancing toward the sacred grounds like an invading army. Jake's phone exploded with messages from tribal members who'd spotted the equipment moving in. "They're not waiting for the legal proceedings," Ayana said, pulling up beside Jake's truck at the Ridge Access Road. Behind them, a convoy of vehicles carried tribal members and supporters, alerted by an emergency phone tree. "They're trying to create facts on the ground before we can stop them." The wolf appeared on the ridge above, its silhouette stark against the rising sun. As Jake watched, more wolves emerged from the shadows to stand beside it, a dozen or more, their presence sending a ripple of unease through the mining company workers. Jake grabbed his toolbox from his truck bed. Years of mechanical work had taught him everything he needed to know about heavy equipment, including their vulnerabilities. "Get everyone in position," he told Ayana. "Keep it peaceful, but don't let those machines move forward." The tribal members spread out, forming a human chain across the access road. College students who'd been camping nearby in solidarity locked arms with tribal elders. News fans began arriving, their cameras capturing the confrontation. Summit Mining's site manager approached waving papers. "We have authorization to begin preliminary work. Anyone interfering will be arrested for trespassing." "Check your permits again," Jake called back, his voice carrying across the growing crowd. "This land's archaeological status requires a full environmental and cultural impact study before any ground can be broken. Where's your documentation for that?" The wolves moved down the ridge, positioning themselves between the machinery and the burial grounds. Their presence created an otherworldly atmosphere that the news cameras couldn't get enough of. Social media exploded with images of wolves standing guard over indigenous sacred land. Jake approached the nearest bulldozer, his trained eye noting crucial weak points. "Your equipment's leaking hydraulic fluid," he announced loudly, pointing to a growing puddle. "That's an EPA violation this close to protected groundwater. You'll need to shut down until it's inspected." The site manager's face reddened. "You can't just, I'm a certified mechanic," Jake interrupted, pulling out his phone to document the leak. "I'm legally obligated to report safety violations. Would you like me to check the rest of your machines? Because I'm seeing a lot of problems here." More tribal members arrived, many carrying signs highlighting Summit Mining's environmental violations at other sites. The wolves paced the ridgeline, their presence drawing more media attention by the minute. Ayana had positioned elders near the burial grounds, where they began conducting traditional prayers. Their songs carried across the desert morning, creating a powerful contrast with the mechanical growl of the idle equipment. "This isn't just about land rights anymore," Jake announced, addressing the growing crowd and media. "This is about corporate accountability, about respecting sacred spaces and environmental laws." He pointed to the wolves. "Even the wildlife knows what's at stake here. How many protected species habitats will be destroyed if this mining operation continues?" The site manager's radio crackled with urgent messages from corporate headquarters. The company's PR team was watching the live coverage, seeing their careful plans unravel in the face of peaceful resistance. Backed by spiritual power and practical legal challenges, Jake moved from machine to machine, his mechanic's expertise finding and documenting violations that would take weeks to address. Each problem he identified meant more delays, more inspections, more costs for Summit Mining. "My grandmother taught me something without ever saying a word," he announced to the cameras. "She taught me that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it's standing in front of bulldozers. Sometimes it's using the system's own rules to protect what matters." The wolf, his wolf, approached one of the machines, raising its head to howl. The sound was picked up by every news microphone, creating a moment that would be replayed around the world. One by one, the other wolves joined in, their voices echoing off the ancient rocks. Workers began stepping away from their equipment, some crossing themselves, others simply refusing to continue. The site manager's phone rang constantly as corporate lawyers tried to handle the PR disaster unfolding in real time. "You want to fight about my grandmother's past?" Jake called out, knowing Summit Mining's executives would see the footage. "Let's talk about your company's past instead. Let's talk about every environmental law you've broken, every sacred site you've destroyed, every community you've torn apart." The sun climbed higher, illuminating the ridge of ancestors in golden light. The wolves maintained their vigil, their presence a bridge between the physical and spiritual aspects of the protest. Jake moved between them, equally comfortable with the sacred power they represented and the practical resistance he was organizing. By mid-morning, Summit Mining's on-site legal team arrived with orders to suspend operations pending review. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Jake and Ayana exchanged knowing looks. This was just the first battle in what would be a longer war. "They'll be back," Ayana said quietly, "with more lawyers, more permits, more pressure." Jake watched the wolves, still standing guard over the sacred land. "And we'll be ready, not just with prayers and protests, but with every legal and technical tool we can find." They thought they could silence us with shame about the past. Instead, they taught us how to fight smarter. The wolf approached Jake, pressing against his leg as cameras flashed around them. In that moment, Jake understood that his role wasn't just about protecting land or preserving culture. It was about finding new ways to resist, combining the wisdom of his ancestors with the tools of the present. The machines fell silent, but the songs of the elders continued, carrying ancient words across land that had just witnessed a new kind of victory. One won not through violence or surrender, but through the combination of spiritual power and practical resistance. The lawsuit arrived 3 days after the bulldozer incident. Summit Mining was seeking $50 million in damages, claiming Jake had defamed their company and interfered with legitimate business operations. The stack of legal papers landed on Ayana's desk with the weight of a tombstone. "They're trying to bankrupt us into submission," Ayana said, scanning the documents. "They've named you personally, the tribal council, and 20 John Does who participated in the protest. They're even claiming the wolf incidents were staged with trained animals." Jake sat heavily in the chair across from her desk, the wolf lying at his feet. Outside, news vans still lingered at the reservation's entrance, hungry for the next development in a story that had captured national attention. "We need more than just environmental regulations and archaeological protections," Jake said. "We need something they can't fight with corporate lawyers." Ayana nodded, pulling out a worn leather journal. "That's why I've been going through the oldest tribal records. There's something about your grandmother's story that doesn't add up. Sarah Whitefeather mentioned that your grandmother led the mining companies away from the real sacred sites. I think she left us a map." They spent the next days in the tribal archives, piecing together fragments of the past. The wolf accompanied them, sometimes leading them to specific boxes or shelves, as if it knew what they were seeking. "Look at this," Ayana said late one evening, spreading out a series of old photographs. "Your grandmother took these just before she left the reservation. They look like random landscape shots, but..." Jake leaned closer, his mechanics eye-catching subtle details. "These aren't random. See how the shadows align." She was marking time and position. "These are survey points." Working through the night, they overlaid the photographs with modern satellite images. A pattern emerged, a series of sites that formed a perfect boundary around the ridge of ancestors, marked by cairns and natural features that had stood for centuries. She was documenting the original reservation boundaries, Ayana realized, not the ones the government drew up in the 1950s, but the true boundaries established by the first treaties. The wolf suddenly stood alert, moving to a dusty corner of the archives. Following it, they found a metal box that hadn't been opened in decades. Inside was a leather pouch, similar to the one the wolf had brought to Jake, containing more photographs and a sealed envelope addressed to my grandchild. Jake's hands shook as he opened it. "To whoever finds this, I made choices that history may judge harshly. The mining companies thought they could use me to find their precious minerals. Instead, I used their money and resources to document our true lands. Every photograph, every survey point they paid me to record was part of proving what was stolen from us. The wolf showed me the way, just as it has shown others before me. Our people's guardians don't just protect the land, they protect the truth. When the time comes, these records will speak louder than any modern deed or corporate claim. Remember who you are." Sarah Thompson. Ayana was already on the phone with the tribe's legal team. "This changes everything. Your grandmother didn't just document sacred sites. She created legally admissible evidence of the original reservation boundaries, evidence that predates Summit Mining's claims." The wolf paced excitedly as they examined the rest of the box's contents. Sarah Thompson had been methodical, using the mining company's own sophisticated survey equipment to create irrefutable documentation of the tribe's territorial rights. "She knew this day would come," Jake said softly. "She knew someone would try to take what was left of our land. So she used their tools against them." They worked through the night, digitizing every document and photograph. By morning, their legal team had begun preparing a countersuit that would challenge not just Summit Mining's current claims, but potentially restore thousands of acres of land to tribal control. The wolf led them to one final location, a cave high on the ridge that hadn't been opened in decades. Inside, they found more recent petroglyphs carved by Sarah Thompson herself. They showed the wolf, the boundary markers, and a figure holding what looked like surveying equipment. "She left her own story here," Ayana said. photographing the carvings, not as a confession, but as a testimony. She knew the land would protect her truth until it was needed. As dawn broke over the ridge, Jake watched Summit Mining's lawyers arrive at the tribal offices, probably expecting to find a demoralized community ready to settle. Instead, they would face evidence that had waited decades to see the light of day. The wolf sat beside Jake, its presence a bridge between past and present. Sarah Thompson hadn't been a traitor who sold out her people. She had been a warrior who found a different way to fight, using the enemy's weapons to protect what mattered most. Your grandmother was clever, Ayanna said, organizing the documents for their lawyers. She knew that sometimes the best way to protect something isn't through direct confrontation, but by playing a longer game. She used their greed against them. Jake picked up the old survey equipment receipts, each one paid for by the mining companies of the 1950s. They gave her everything she needed to prove their claims were built on lies, all because they thought they were using her. The wolf howled as the sun crested the ridge, its voice carrying across decades of hidden resistance and patient waiting. In the distance, Summit Mining's idle equipment cast long shadows across land that had just become a new kind of battleground, one where the weapons would be truth and memory instead of bulldozers and corporate money. The federal courthouse in Salt Lake City had never seen anything like it. Hundreds of tribal members and supporters gathered outside, many wearing t-shirts bearing the image of a wolf silhouetted against the ridge of ancestors. News crews jostled for position as Jake and Ayanna climbed the steps, legal teams in tow, the wolf walking boldly beside them. Inside the courtroom, Judge Michael Running Bear presided over what had become one of the most watched land rights cases in recent history. His presence was itself remarkable, one of the few Native American federal judges in the country, assigned to the case by random selection that felt anything but random. Summit Mining's lawyers presented their case first, armed with sophisticated geological surveys and corporate documents. They argued about mineral rights, economic benefits, and technical boundary disputes. Their presentation was polished, corporate, and coldly efficient. When it was their turn, Jake's team began with Sarah Thompson's photographs. "Your Honor," their lead attorney started, "what you're about to see is not just evidence of land boundaries. It's documentation of a quiet resistance that spanned generations." Sarah Thompson didn't just take these photographs. She created a legal time capsule, using the very tools and resources of those who sought to exploit her people. The courtroom screens filled with Sarah's carefully documented survey points, each one matched to modern GPS coordinates. The mining company's lawyers shifted uncomfortably as their own historical documents were used to validate the tribe's claims. The company that preceded Summit Mining paid for every photograph, every survey, the attorney continued. They created an undeniable record of the true reservation boundaries, thinking they were exploiting a tribal member's cooperation. Instead, they were funding the preservation of evidence that would one day be used against their successors. Outside the courthouse windows, the wolf appeared on a nearby rooftop, visible to everyone in the courtroom. More wolves gradually joined it, forming a silent audience to the proceedings. Judge Running Bear made no comment about their presence, but a slight smile crossed his face. "Your Honor," Summit Mining's lawyer protested, "we can't allow theatrical displays of trained animals to influence these proceedings." "Are you suggesting," Judge Running Bear asked dryly, "that the defendants have trained an entire pack of wild wolves to appear at legally significant moments?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom, but Jake noticed the judge studying the wolves with an expression of deep understanding. The evidence mounted throughout the day. Sarah's documented boundaries aligned perfectly with oral histories and archaeological findings. The mining company's own geological surveys from the 1950s confirmed the locations of sacred sites they had claimed not to know about. During a brief recess, Jake overheard two Summit Mining executives arguing in the hallway. Their stock was plummeting as investors watched the case unfold. Environmental groups were calling for investigations into their other operations. The story had grown beyond a simple land dispute into a nationwide discussion about corporate accountability and indigenous rights. Back in session, Judge Running Bear asked Jake to take the stand. "Mr. Thompson, you bridged two worlds in this case. You're both a skilled mechanic who documented modern corporate violations and a tribal member reconnecting with his heritage. What do you believe your grandmother was trying to achieve?" Jake looked at the wolf, then back at the judge. "She understood something I'm only now beginning to learn. Protection doesn't always look like opposition. Sometimes it looks like patience, like using the tools of those who would take from you to ultimately preserve what matters most." The judge nodded slowly. "And what matters most in this case?" "The truth, Your Honor, not just about boundaries and mineral rights, but about how we view the land itself. My grandmother proved the original reservation boundaries using their own tools, but she was proving something bigger, that this land isn't just property to be bought and sold. It's a trust we inherit, a story we're part of." As Jake spoke, the wolves outside began to howl, their voices carrying through the courthouse walls. Judge Running Bear made no attempt to restore order as the sound filled the courtroom. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, listening. When the wolves fell silent, the judge opened his eyes and began to speak. "I find myself in an unusual position. The technical evidence in this case is clear. The original reservation boundaries were accurately documented by Sarah Thompson, using methodologies that meet modern legal standards. But there's something else here, something that speaks to the very nature of justice." He looked at the wolves, then back to the courtroom. "This court rules not only in favor of the Shadow River tribe's claim, but extends that ruling to include punitive damages against Summit Mining for their attempted exploitation of Sarah Thompson's documented resistance." The judge held up his hand as Summit's lawyers began to protest. "Furthermore, I am issuing an injunction preventing any mining activity within the original reservation boundaries, pending a full archaeological and environmental review that must include tribal oversight." Outside, the cheers of the crowd echoed through the courthouse walls. The wolves raised their voices again, this time in what sounded like triumph. But Judge Running Bear wasn't finished. "Let the record show something else. Today, we witness not just the resolution of a land dispute, but the validation of a different kind of resistance. Sarah Thompson turned corporate greed into a weapon for preservation. She understood that sometimes the longest path is the most effective one." He looked directly at Jake. "Your grandmother left you more than evidence, Mr. Thompson. She left you a lesson about how to fight battles that seem impossible to win. Sometimes the wolf doesn't lead us to confront our enemies. It leads us to outsmart them." As they left the courthouse, Jake and Ayanna emerged into a sea of celebrations. The wolf, his wolf, waited at the top of the steps, its mission seemingly complete. Behind it, the pack stood proud against the setting sun, guardians of a victory that had been generations in the making. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked, watching Summit Mining's lawyers make their defeated exit. Jake looked at the wolf, understanding finally the full circle of his journey. "Now we protect the land the way my grandmother did, not just with boundaries and laws, but with stories and truth. We become the guardians for the next generation." The wolf howled one last time, its voice carrying a message that Jake could now fully understand. It wasn't just about saving the land. It was about learning how to fight in ways that preserved not just places, but wisdom. His grandmother had turned exploitation into protection. He had turned a personal journey into a victory for his people. As the sun set behind the mountains, Jake realized that some battles are won not in moments of confrontation, but through patient acts of resistance passed down through generations, guided by guardians who appear when they're needed most, leading us to truths we didn't know we were seeking.